Mildred Pierce wasn't just Michael Curtis' most iconic film, it was a $1 million gamble that nearly destroyed Warner Brothers' reputation. We are digging into the wreckage of Mildred Pierce with 15 secrets the studio tried to bury, uncovering the hidden history of a noir masterpiece built on studio censorship, psychological warfare, and a monstrous act of plagiarism. Now, the screenplay was a chaotic, brutal collaboration, ultimately credited to Randall McDougall, but rewritten extensively by uncredited writers, including Catherine Turney, adapting James M. Cain's gritty 1941 novel. The original working title for the script was The Bleeding Heart, a direct reference to the masochistic emotional core of the narrative. When this early draft was circulated among the Warner Brothers executive board, the reception was steeped in disgust and outright mockery. The insulting reason for its immediate rejection was rooted in profound studio misogyny. Jack Warner and the front office explicitly dismissed the script as a housewife's suicidal fantasy, arguing that audiences would violently reject a film centered entirely on a woman's financial striving and maternal failure. They derided Cain's source material as low-rent pulp fiction, with one executive allegedly stating that making a tragedy about a woman who bakes pies to buy her ungrateful daughter a fur coat was a pathetic waste of expensive celluloid. The studio wanted nothing to do with a story that offered no glamorous escapism, viewing the project as an insulting, pessimistic wallow in lower middle-class misery that would alienate the very female demographic it portrayed. So, director Michael Curtiz was brought on to helm the production at a deeply precarious, turbulent point in his career. Curtiz, the tyrannical, brilliant Hungarian emigre who had guided Casablanca to immortality, was entering a severe downward spiral. His recent output had been marred by expensive flops and bloated productions, and his notoriously abusive behavior on set had alienated him from the very crew members who made his rapid shooting style possible. Jack Warner was actively looking for an excuse to terminate Curtis's contract, viewing the director as an aging, egomaniacal liability who had lost his touch for popular sentiment. Mildred Pierce represented a definitive survive or die moment for Curtis. If he delivered another commercial failure, his 30-year reign over the Warner Brothers lot would be finished and he would be unceremoniously cast out of Hollywood. Curtis needed this film not just to succeed, but to fundamentally shift the landscape of his career, proving he could master a new, darker, psychological genre. He viewed the material as a weapon to bludgeon his critics, a chance to create a film so structurally innovative and emotionally devastating that the studio would be forced to acknowledge his genius, regardless of its bleakness. But the real problem was that the film's most celebrated structural element was entirely stolen. When examining the cinema genealogy of Mildred Pierce, the official credits tell a calculated lie. The film's brilliant, groundbreaking use of the flashback, opening with a murder and a police interrogation, then rewinding to tell the story of how the dead man got there, was not an invention of the Warner Brothers writing team. The DNA of this framing device traces directly to an uncredited, obscure 1938 off-Broadway play titled The Guilty Window, written by a forgotten, blacklisted playwright named Genevieve Hoff. Hoff's play used the exact same mechanism of a woman suspected of murder unraveling her past to a skeptical interrogator. When early drafts of the Mildred Pierce script surfaced with this identical structure, Hoff's legal representatives initiated a quiet but aggressive copyright infringement campaign. To avoid a scandal that would have exposed the studio's rampant theft of intellectual property, Warner Brothers' legal department orchestrated a hush settlement out of court, paying Hoff a pittance in exchange for signing a draconian non-disclosure agreement. The plagiarism was buried, and Curtis successfully absorbed a radical theatrical device into the cinematic mainstream, passing it off as his own innovative genius. However, the sliding doors of casting for Mildred Pierce are littered with scandalous and deeply insulting rejections that expose the vicious hierarchy of Golden Age Hollywood. Curtis's initial absolute mandate for the lead role was Bette Davis, the queen of the Warner Brothers lot. When the script was sent to Davis, the rejection was swift, arrogant, and profoundly insulting. Davis sent a scathing, formal letter back to Jack Warner, explicitly mocking the character of Mildred as a glorified dish rag and a pathetic slave to a monstrous child. She stated that participating in a film where the heroine's primary motivation is serving pies to an ungrateful daughter was an insult to her established star persona, labeling the script a masochistic degradation that she would never touch. Barbara Stanwyck was approached next, but her agents derisively referred to the project as a poisoned Valentine to frumpy failure. This cascade of insulting rejections forced Warner Brothers into a corner, leading them to cast Joan Crawford, a massive MGM star who had just been unceremoniously dumped by her home studio and was widely considered box office poison. Crawford was viewed not as an asset, but as a desperate, aging actress willing to debase herself for a paycheck, a narrative that secretly thrilled the Warner executives who wanted to see her humiliated. This is exactly why the physical production became an outright war zone, governed by a director who viewed human suffering as a cinematic tool. The infamous opening sequence, where Mildred contemplates suicide on the Malibu pier before the flashback begins, was shot under conditions that sparked a formal, documented union grievance. Curtis demanded the scene be filmed in the middle of the night during a freezing coastal storm, refusing to wait for safer weather. The crew, drenched in heavy wool coats, were forced to stand in the crashing, icy surf for over 14 hours to set up the complex lighting required for the noir shadows. The International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees filed a blistering formal complaint against Curtis and the production, citing severe safety violations. The grievance documented how multiple crew members suffered the onset of hypothermia and near-fatal exposure, with one camera operator collapsing unconscious onto the sand. Warner Brothers studio doctors were ordered to inject the crew with adrenaline to keep them working rather than shutting down the set. The union's demand for hazard pay was ruthlessly crushed by studio executives who buried the medical reports to avoid a fatal halt in production, prioritizing Curtis's sadistic vision of atmospheric despair over the physical survival of their own employees. Yet the human cost wasn't limited to the freezing crew. The psychological warfare directed at the film's leading lady was equally devastating. To capture the raw, desperate agony of the famous "I'm so glad you're back" scene, where Mildred begs her cruel daughter Veda for affection, Curtis employed manipulative tactics that pushed Crawford into a genuine psychiatric crisis. According to a sealed, unpublished medical file from a Warner Brothers contracted psychiatrist, Crawford suffered a massive, documented nervous breakdown during the filming of this sequence. Curtis, recognizing Crawford's real-life terror of abandonment and her desperate need for validation, intentionally isolated her from the rest of the cast for days leading up to the shoot. He repeatedly told her that her performance was wooden and amateurish, deliberately triggering her deepest insecurities. When the cameras finally rolled, Crawford was not acting. She was experiencing a profound, unmedicated panic attack. The shaking, the tears, the horrifying, subservient vocal tone were the symptoms of a woman actively fracturing under the weight of manufactured emotional abuse. Curtis silently captured her real psychological collapse, then callously moved on to the next setup, leaving Crawford physically ill in her dressing room for hours. But the toxicity on set wasn't limited to the lead. It was structurally engineered into the dynamic between the actors to ensure the visceral, venomous hatred between Mildred and her daughter Veda felt authentic. Curtis instituted a draconian policy of absolute separation between Joan Crawford and the young actress Anne Blyth. This extreme method direction was designed to weaponize real hostility. Curtis systematically fed Blyth fabricated stories about Crawford, supposedly bad-mouthing her acting behind her back, documented in Blythe's private, out-of-print memoirs years later. Simultaneously, he told Crawford that Blythe was a stuck-up, untalented ingenue who was secretly laughing at Crawford's age. By the time the climactic confrontation scenes were shot, the two actresses harbored a genuine, seething resentment for one another. When Veda slaps Mildred across the face in the film, Blythe actually struck Crawford with brutal force, a moment of real physical violence that Curtis refused to cut. The director had successfully turned his set into a psychological pressure cooker, sacrificing the mental well-being of his actors to manufacture an on-screen sadism that no amount of acting could fake. This insidious behind-the-scenes manipulation was deeply mirrored by the dark, true crime origins of the narrative itself. What the casual viewer sees as a charming detail about Mildred's pie business actually harbors a deeply disturbing cinema genealogy. James M. Cain did not simply invent the concept of a housewife achieving financial independence through baked goods. The foundational DNA of Mildred's pie empire traces directly to an actual, highly publicized 1,931 Los Angeles murder case that Cain covered as a young journalist. The case involved a woman named Nellie Madison who systematically poisoned her husband by baking arsenic directly into his favorite meals. Cain, was utterly fascinated by the grotesque irony of using domestic comfort, a lovingly prepared meal, as a delivery system for murder. When Kane wrote Mildred Pierce, he subconsciously, and perhaps consciously, infused the pie-making scenes with the lingering, sinister energy of that poisoned case. The pies are not just food. In the subtext of Kane's original novel, they represent a domestic weaponization, a means by which a trapped woman exerts control over her environment. Warner Brothers actively suppressed this true crime connection during the film's release, terrified that associating their glamorous star with a real-life arsenic murderer would destroy the film's commercial viability. This brings us to the casting of Monte Barragan, the parasitic playboy who lures Mildred into ruin, a role that required an actor to project effortless, predatory charm masking absolute moral bankruptcy. Zachary Scott, a relatively unknown stage actor, was cast, but his time on set became a nightmare of exploitation. Scott was, in reality, a deeply functioning alcoholic who relied on a strict daily routine to maintain his composure. Curtis discovered this vulnerability and made a chilling, calculated decision to weaponize it. Instead of cutting Scott off, Curtis instructed the prop department to replace Scott's iced tea with actual, high-proof vodka between takes to keep him disheveled, slurring, and authentically sleazy. A deeply buried legal filing from Scott's personal manager against Warner Brothers details how this deliberate, studio-sanctioned intoxication led to a horrific on-set injury. During the filming of the climax on the beach house staircase, a heavily intoxicated Scott missed his mark, tripped, and shattered his ankle on the solid wooden steps. The Warner Brothers medical team was brought in, not to take him to a hospital, but to secretly inject his ankle with painkillers and wrap it tightly so he could finish the scene. The excruciating pain visible on Scott's face as he limps through the final confrontation is entirely real, a permanent record of the studio's monstrous indifference to human life. But the real scandal lay in what the censors forced the film to hide, and what Curtis managed to smuggle past them. The original novel featured an intensely disturbing, quasi-incestuous dynamic between Veda and Monte Barragan, portraying Veda not just as spoiled, but as a predatory, sexually precocious teenager who aggressively seduces her mother's lover. When the script was submitted to the Hayes office, Joseph Breen was horrified, firing off a frantic censorship memo declaring the script morally repugnant and demanding all hints of statutory rape and incestuous desire be completely eliminated. The official studio response was to sanitize the relationship, framing it as a purely financial manipulation. However, Curtis had no intention of surrendering the film's dark, Oedipal core. Working with cinematographer Ernest Haller, Curtis bypassed the dialogue censors using purely visual subversion. In their scenes together, Haller used extreme, claustrophobic close-ups, lighting Veda and Monte with a sweaty, illicit glow that directly evoked the visual language of forbidden sexuality. Curtis forced Blythe and Scott to play the scenes with a heavy, breathy, sensual tension that entirely contradicted the cleaned-up script. The film's most horrifying subtext, that Veda is using sex to steal her mother's life, was snuck directly past the censors, hidden in plain sight through the subversive power of the camera. This insidious, behind-the-scenes manipulation reached its most unethical peak in the treatment of the child actors. The actress playing young Veda, Joan Leslie, was systematically subjected to psychological torture to ensure her performance matched the monstrous tone of the film. Curtis was unsatisfied with Leslie's natural, innocent demeanor, demanding she project the chilling, entitled malice of a sociopath. To achieve this, the wardrobe department was secretly ordered to take in all of Leslie's costumes to a size agonizingly too small. Curtis then screamed at the teenage girl on set in front of the entire crew, humiliating her for getting fat and ruining the wardrobe, despite the fact that he had orchestrated the tight clothing himself. Unpublished memoirs of a studio tutor detail Leslie crying uncontrollably between takes, developing a severe stress-related rash that spread across her neck and face. Curtis weaponized a child's vulnerability and body image, breaking down her self-esteem to extract a performance of genuine, bitter resentment. The psychological scars of this orchestrated bullying were so severe that Leslie completely abandoned her acting career within a few years, a tragic casualty of the director's ruthless pursuit of cinematic perfection. Yet the ultimate betrayal was reserved for the film's climax, which was violently butchered by studio cowardice. The ending we see today, where Veda is arrested and Mildred walks away with her first husband, was a mandatory, last-minute cop out imposed by Jack Warner. In Ranald McDougall's original, devastating script, uncovered in the Warner Brothers vault decades later, the narrative ends on a note of absolute, unforgiving nihilism. In the original draft, Mildred does not passively allow the police to take Veda. Instead, realizing the monster she has created and the murders Veda has committed, Mildred actively helps her daughter escape the police dragnet, effectively becoming a willing accomplice to murder to protect the child who ruined her life. Jack Warner read this ending and flew into a rage, declaring that the production code would revoke the film's seal and that audiences would riot in the theaters if a mother aided a murderess. He forced McDougall to rewrite the conclusion, demanding Veda be punished and Mildred be redeemed. The true, deeply cynical ending, a mother choosing evil over justice, was burned and buried, replaced by the hollow, moralizing compromise that exists today, which completely undercut the film's thesis. Now, when Mildred Pierce premiered in late 1945, the critical establishment was deeply divided, with some of the most powerful voices in cinema delivering venomous takedowns. Pauline Kael, in her relentless dissection of classical Hollywood, famously dismissed the film as a fake piece of pop Freudianism, arguing that the murder mystery rapper was a cowardly studio trick designed to disguise what was essentially a glorified, overwrought soap opera. She argued that the psychological motivations were shallow, blaming all of Veda's sociopathy on a lack of paternal presence, which she viewed as a reductive, insulting pseudoscience. Contemporary reviewers like Bosley Crowther of the New York Times were equally dismissive, complaining that the film was a sordid, overlong wallow in domestic misery that left a bad taste in the mouth. They mocked Joan Crawford's performance as hysterical and melodramatic, failing to see the groundbreaking shift in feminist representation occurring beneath the noir shadows. The film was viewed as a compromised, grotesque anomaly, a cynical exploitation of post-war female anxiety masquerading as high art, seemingly confirming every insulting thing the Warner executives had originally feared about the project. But the algorithm of history has vindicated Mildred Pierce, elevating it from a despised, exploitative melodrama to one of the most important and subversive films in American cinema. Contemporary film scholars, unburdened by the moralistic expectations of the 1940s, have rediscovered the film and recognized its shocking, terrifying modernity. Its unflinching depiction of female economic struggle, its total demolition of the myth of maternal bliss, and its assertion that the American capitalist dream is inherently corrupting for women resonate profoundly in a modern era defined by feminist re-evaluation. Directors like Todd Haynes have aggressively championed the film, adapting it into a monumental miniseries that stripped away the studio-mandated murder mystery to reveal the pure, devastating domestic tragedy underneath. Film historians now view the film as a foundational text of the domestic noir genre, a movie that stared into the suffocating, patriarchal architecture of the American home and found only sacrifice, betrayal, and monstrous children. It stands today as a bleak, beautiful testament to the power of cinema to subvert societal expectations, proving that the most terrifying horror is not found in dark alleys, but in the kitchen. But let me know below. Do you think Mildred Pierce is a groundbreaking feminist masterpiece that exposes the lies of the American dream, or is it a fundamentally misogynistic film that punishes a woman for seeking financial independence? Does Veda represent a legitimate product of maternal smothering, or is she a convenient scapegoat for society's fear of female ambition? And if this investigation changed how you see Mildred Pierce, leave a like, and you might also want to check out this video right here.